Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mike Sherrod, and I'm here today with my colleague Lisa Bolton and our very special guest, Ontario's immediate past Chief Prevention Officer, Ron Kaluski. We have approximately 1,500 people registered today for the webinar, and it only goes to show the importance of this topic. In terms of logistics this morning, Ron will start us off with an Ontario update. Then I'll take us through the second topic, an ounce of prevention. And then I'll pass it over to Lisa, who will then discuss best practices when an accident happens. The format for this morning is as follows. We'll present till approximately 10 o'clock, and then we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can up until approximately 10:30. If you have a question for us, please type it into the Q&A box on your screen, not in the chat box, which I think should actually be disabled. So please type in your questions into the Q&A box. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but if we don't get to your question, please reach out to us after the presentation and we'll do our best to respond to your questions. Finally, a recording of this presentation and the slide deck will be on our website in a day or two. So let's get started. At this point, I want to introduce Ron to everyone. He's no stranger to the majority of us. Ron, as you know, is the immediate past Chief Prevention Officer. The Chief Prevention Officer oversees the Prevention Office within the Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development and has a wide range of responsibilities, including working with Ontario's health and safety system partners to prevent workplace injuries, illnesses, and fatalities, reporting to the Minister on the performance of Ontario's occupational health and safety system through an annual report, setting province-wide training and safety program standards, and establishes and implements new provincial occupational health and safety strategies. And on a personal note, working with Ron over the course of the last 18 months during the pandemic, I don't think we could have had a better person in that seat. Passionate, calm, provided great resources, and we're really going to miss you, Ron. We really did appreciate all your leadership through this, and I'm saying that optimistically that we're out of this, but we really do appreciate all the efforts you made over these last 18 months. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Ron, and Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate the kind words, and thank you for inviting me to this. I think these types of presentations, especially from what we've gone through in the past 18 months, is really incredible. It's an opportunity to share best practices and to learn, because a lot of what we did learn out of COVID really has application when it comes to the day-to-day operation of businesses in Ontario. For many of you, you may not have known, but approximately 2 years ago, the ministry changed. We were the Ministry of Labour, which primarily was responsible for inspections, employment standards legislation, and labor relations arbitration. And then in November of 2019, we became a much larger ministry responsible pretty much for everything that had to do with work. We not only retained our inspectorate responsibilities and responsibilities over employment services and prevention, but we also added employment training and global talent and settlement, which is essentially immigration services, and workforce policy and innovation. And this expanded our ministry to almost 2,400 people, but really responsible for everything that had to do with work. So we do, as you see on the slide, the prevention of occupational diseases and injuries, including mental health, enforcement of regulations under OSHA, and I'll explain some of the challenges we had through COVID, because when you think of public health and occupational health, there are subtle differences that could lead and did lead to some confusion in the workplace. We administer and enforce the Employment Standards Act, administer employment training programs such as apprenticeship and federal and provincial job training initiatives, and that amounts to almost $1.2 billion in incentives for unemployed, underemployed, new Canadians and youth. Global Talent and Settlement Services. Many people are unaware that the province and cities play an important role in the immigration process. A lot of people think that it's purely a federal responsibility, but there's a huge component of delegated authorities that are into the provincial system that allows them, based on their future of work planning, to determine what skills are needed to maintain a strong and healthy economy. And workforce policy and innovation, that really, we work to ensure that Ontario workers have the skills to maintain a competitive economy. And you probably have heard quite a bit about the transformation of the former College of Trades and how the government is intervening in the 150 skilled trades and sub-trades in Ontario to try to address the anticipated shortage of about 250,000 skilled trades over the next 10 years. So this has been a huge initiative by the province. And we still continue to provide labor relations solutions and labor policy. We are the final arbiters when it comes to labor relations settlements and issues related to collective agreements, arbitrations, and so on. And we also oversee a number of agencies such as the WSIB, which is an important partner in the prevention side, the Fairness Commission, and the Office of the Worker and Employer Advisor. Next slide. So, the last 18 months, I'm sure, social scientists of all sorts are going to look at COVID as one big petri dish. Everything from environment to changing nature of work to working at home, the new realities of what the future will hold will emanate as a result of what we've learned from COVID. And this was a full court press on behalf of our whole ministry. Not only did our employment training programs start to adapt to shift to the almost 1 million gig economy and low income workers that were largely affected immediately affected by the COVID, but also our inspectors shifted from routine occupational health and safety inspections to more of compliance and enforcement of not only local but provincial emergency regulations as well as COVID. From a prevention perspective, we retooled and looked at developing over 250 guidance documents, which incredibly 1.5 million downloads by different sectors across the economy as we moved from essential business activities in March of last year to the phase 1 reopening, to the color-coded reopening, to the reopenings that have occurred just after Christmas and as they maintain through the vaccination process and where we are today. And our enforcement units have undertaken about 60, well, probably by now 70,000 compliance visits as we went through the various stages to ensure that workplaces were abiding by both public health as well as OSHA requirements. And as indicated, we administered job support and training initiatives through the provincial funded programs. And we provided legislative and regulatory support. And that included the provincial sick day credit top-up, which is recently announced that will be extended into by the end of the year. And we made several training requirements under OSHA that allowed training providers to continue to provide essential health and safety training in a more virtual environment, whether that was e-learning or virtual learning, such as what we're doing today. And actually, that was a very significant uptake for both employers and training providers, as it substantially reduced the cost of travel and other costs to the employer by enabling their employees to take such things as joint health and safety training, as well as other programs in a virtual environment. And the prevention system as a whole, we provided some critical advice in the opening of the economy, whether it be business as it moved forward, or maintaining the agriculture system, temporary foreign workers, as well as assisting the education ministry and boards of education in reopening and continuing to stay open in both their partial environment and full environment. And most importantly, and probably the biggest challenge we had, was opening Ontario's court system, the 88 court buildings across the province, as well as the number of courtrooms. So that was quite a challenge, but quite interesting. Next slide, please. So what have we learned? One of the big things we've learned is there's a difference between public health and occupational health and safety. And I'll give you a good example where public health would say, please stay 2 meters apart. And that was translated in many different ways. Some people would say, okay, I have to wear a mask if I'm within 2 meters, but if I'm not within 2 meters, then I don't have to wear a mask. Whereas under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, it's pretty specific that in certain circumstances, a mask won't suffice. Under OSHA, you need to wear proper PPE, which might include a surgical grade mask and eye protection, where under public health measures, a simple cloth mask would have sufficed. So we had a challenge dealing with that, and it really illustrated the need to have clear and concise information. And we were working in a very complex environment. We had, at the time was the change to Ontario Health back in January. So the LHINs devolved into Ontario Health. We had Public Health Ontario. We had 34 public health districts. We had OSHA. We had local public health and bylaw enforcement. So there was a lot of activity and sometimes caused quite a bit of confusion for employers. We needed, as mentioned, to ensure that clarity information and simple information is critical. What do we need to do to both stay safe and be compliant with both legislation and local bylaw enforcement? We need to ensure that the information needed to be tailored to the audience. And our biggest learning out of this was, how do we transfer knowledge, and how is that knowledge translated by employers and employees? And important also was continuous communications. Never assume that people are aware. And the interesting part was that employers traditionally, only worried about talking to their employees about what they did at work. And as COVID progressed, we started seeing employers starting to, spend time about talking to them about information that's available to keep them safe, both at work and while at home and in the community. And we do know that from research, and the research is continuing, that community spread was the largest issue that we had, as opposed to workplace spread, although it did happen, but probably less than 10% of transmission occurred in the workplace. Most of it occurred within the community. And we spent a lot of time working with industry and employers and employer associations to help them increase their knowledge and expertise in what they needed to do in order to stay safe and what to communicate to their employees. And sharing best practices so as to not reinvent the wheel. And we had a really good relationship from the get-go with the construction industry. We started off with guidance material in early March after COVID was, the COVID crisis began in 2020. And we kept up regular meetings with all of the major building associations and leaders in the industry to be able to provide and share best practices, everything from PPE to non-compliance to what have you. And it really worked. And sharing best practices is a good form of ensuring that you get the best information quickly as possible. And also all forms of media and learning is needed. Not everybody learns in the same way. There's virtual, in-person, digital, video, poster. All of these things were really important. And most importantly, the engagement of your employers in the health and safety committee and or your representative, so that everybody feels that they're not only sharing the crisis, but they're also sharing and part of the solution to that crisis. And that builds a lot of confidence in an organization. Those employers that had strong safety cultures and a strong safety plan really came through this very well. And I use the example of one organization, a broader public sector organization many of you probably went into, was the LCBO. Right from the get-go, they really embraced the concept of distancing, PPE, hand washing, controls of people coming into their building, which really ended up being a very positive thing and a very low transmission rate for employees. Also, don't be afraid to ask for advice. And employees, are your greatest asset both on and off the job. So spending the time with them is really important. Next slide. So really, what did we really learn out of this? Well, after 50 years and millions of hours of training and tens of millions of dollars in investing in health and safety, we found that many businesses struggled with very simple tasks and basic concepts of health and safety, like risk assessment. And right from the get-go, when COVID started, we said you need to, and even in normal times and circumstance, undertake a risk assessment to know what the hazards and risks are within your workplace. And this risk assessment would really guide the development of your plan. The second thing that we learned was the hierarchy of controls, which is the fundamental requirement for the elimination of hazards and risks in any situations, including a pandemic, was not fully understood. And, a good illustration of that was that, wear a mask. Well, there's several things you could have done. The masking, if you think of an inverted pyramid, at the very top, or the inverted base of the pyramid, is the elimination of the risk. So working from home is an example of an elimination of risk. And as you move down that hierarchy, the last part is masking and source control. But there are other things like barriers, the barriers between stations or seats or workplaces, or your clients and the cashier as an example, washing hands, cough and sneeze control, and so on and so forth. I use the illustration that what does an employer have to do if they have one employee that works at the 50-yard line of BMO Field and works in a phone booth with no contact with people? Essentially, washing their hands and making that person aware of what needs to be done when they leave the workplace and when they come into the workplace. However, if you're working at a Home Depot, how many people do you control coming in, making available hand sanitizers, barriers between cashiers, enforcing masks and eye protection? Those type of things can all be put in. One size doesn't fit all, especially involving the knowledge transfer and knowledge translation. Not everybody learns the same. Some people are visual learners. Putting out a document that is 300 pages long that tells you how you're going to manage your infectious prevention and control isn't really that helpful. And what we found in the healthcare industry is a lot of infectious prevention and control guidance was built for regulated health professionals. And when you had people that were non-regulated, PSWs, community support workers, support staff in hospitals, those IPAC controls were not written for that audience. And we've actually invested $250,000 into a federal study working with St. Michael's to actually build guidance for non-regulated health professionals. Leadership and knowledge was a clear differentiator. And I'll just use the example of the long-term care sector. We heard a lot about the significance and the impact in the long-term care sector. However, there was probably in excess of 900 long-term care homes in the province, or even more. But the vast majority of those, probably 2/3, didn't have an outbreak. They were well prepared, well trained. Similarly, with farming and outbreaks with temporary foreign workers, only 5% of the 1,500 factory farms in the province of Ontario were immediately affected in a significant way. The others weren't, but you don't hear about that. Vulnerable workers, women and wage earners, people working multiple jobs and living in congregate settings were challenged significantly. We saw in Brampton, where you have multi-generational families working multiple jobs, that was really a real concern about the outbreak. We saw with the situation with Amazon, where the medical officer of health suspended public transit, largely because large number of people were migrating to those one facilities. The three Amazon facilities, the one in Scarborough, one in Bolton, and one in Brampton, each employed about 5,000 people. All those people come to work, the majority of those people came to work on public transit. So it was really a significant opportunity for community spread. Employers, as I'd mentioned, became responsible for not only activities at work, but also providing information to the staff on safety off the job as well. And we've seen this even more as employers are providing information on vaccinations and information on trying to dispel myths and provide credible sources for information to help their employees make the right decisions. And new opportunities for learning involved. As I mentioned, we've gone virtual in many ways, which is actually going to achieve a significant economic benefit to employers in the future. And we also, as part of our strategy, which I'll talk to in a minute, we needed to start focusing more on demonstrable outcomes and evidence as opposed to just outputs. So for example, I earlier on said we've trained millions of hours in things, but it really didn't work at the end of the day. And we really need to rethink how we do things and do it in a way that is not an encumbrance to employers and incentivizes employers to do better. Next slide, please. So, we're going to talk about this as with Michael and the other speakers, but we also learned that building a culture of safety is more important than taking a course. And in the past 2 years, we've invested, and it got a bit derailed. Well, it got a lot derailed as a result of COVID, but there's an incentive program that we've developed in conjunction with the WSIB, ourselves, and industry, which is called Supporting Ontario Safe Employer Program. And that program is predicated on employers building a health and safety management system and incentivizing them to do it. And incentivizing that means you can actually save money by taking programs that lead to a health and safety management program, such as ISO 45001, CSA 18001, Certificate of Recognition in Construction, which is known as CORE 2020. And even if you have your own proprietary health and safety management system, you can download what is known as the CPO's program guidance. And if you tick all the boxes, you can apply for a recognition. And once you have your program accredited, or you demonstrate proof of ISO or CORE or CSA, you can then apply for recognition, which means you'll get a certificate from the Chief Prevention Officer, a handshake from the Premier, and through our cooperation with WSIB, substantial incentives over the next 3 years. So if you're an employer that employs, let's say, 1,000 people, you have the potential to garner rebates of up to $300,000 over 3 years. We announced 3 just last month that were employers of 100, 200, and 300, and they shared about 100,000, 80,000, and 50,000 respectively over 3 years. The other thing that you can do is through WSIB is the Health and Safety Excellence Program. and you can receive up to $5,000 each year by participating in that program. And what it is a series of courses that lead you through to culminate into a health and safety management system. So you can look at the SOCI, Supporting Ontario Safe Employer Workplace, and we've got up to about $150 million when this program goes forward over 3 years for incentives. Again, the importance of risk assessments and safety plans. The government recently announced that last week that we've been building an automated safety plan builder, and this will be a living, breathing online tool that employers can log into and build their safety plan online. And as we evolve beyond COVID, it will be a fully automated risk-based assessment. So you can do everything from type in the chemicals you used, it will tell you what carcinogens they are, and potentially what alternatives you could use as opposed to exposing your employees or public to those. And the other part is managing a safety and audit inspection, and that's really focusing on ensuring you have a robust health and safety committee, and employers with over 19 employees must have a joint occupational health and safety committee. Those with under 19 and greater than 5, you need to have a health and safety rep. And the government announced through our prevention system over the next 3 years, we're investing $3.5 million a year to train up to 60,000 health and safety reps for small business. Small business is about 80% of our economy and accounts for 63% of our injuries. So this is a program that you should look up if you're a small employer. You can get up to $150 for the participation of your employee to take the program, and the course is free for those employees. Next slide, please. So as Michael indicated, I've ridden off into the sunset, and I'm pleased to announce that our third Chief Prevention Officer, coincidentally known as C3PO, is Dr. Joel Modi. And Dr. Modi is not only a clinician, but he is also a PhD in epidemiology. And this fits in very nicely with where we've left off and initiated our strategy, which is looking at evidence-based and outcome-focused approach to the science of injury. It's no longer appropriate to simply state that 70,000 people were injured, but we're not sure why. We're starting to look at why injury occurs, the epidemiology behind injuries, and actually over the next 5 years take a substantial bite out of both occupational disease-related deaths and injuries, which occur about 2/3 of fatalities in the province on an annual basis are occupational disease-related, and the other third is traumatic. And we're also now introducing mental health as a significant part of prevention. We know that 60% of injuries have a mental health component. 1 in 5 employees of the population have mental health issues, and really, employers really need to be on top of this. We want to provide them with information to be able to address this in a very positive and effective way. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of resources available throughout now. We're still continuing with wearing masks and appropriate PPE until we're fully out of the woods, and practicing that physical distancing. Feeling sick, if you stay at home, continue to wash your hands and cough and sneeze control, and take your breaks outdoors if you can. We found that the largest spread in those organizations that stay open are in the lunchroom and the warehouse, where people, or during breaks where they have smoke breaks or a coffee break. Those were the most significant and substantive areas where the challenge of transmission occurs. And remember, even though you're vaccinated, you can still get it and spread it, although vaccinations will lessen the significance of the symptoms of COVID. Really, we've moved from the controversy of rapid screening, which people say, why do I have to get screened? rapid antigen screening, which we were heavily involved in a lot of industry, to now we're into the issues of mandatory vaccinations, vaccination passports and certificates and so on, which I was on a meeting yesterday, which, some industries are requiring employees to demonstrate they've been vaccinated. If they cannot do that, to take a course. If they still not, we're now into various forms of labor relations. So stay tuned. That will evolve. I just as an FYI, I ran into a doctor that said COVID has now become a disease of the unvaccinated, and we've seen that with the number of ICU admissions and so on. It is really tragic. Flu vaccines have been around for almost 25 years. It is not a new science. It's been around forever. So I would trust that, but again, we are where we are. Next slide, please. So I mentioned about the health safety program. There's $10 million available. You can go on the ministry website and Google that, and you can find out all the information. We will rebate you immediately to your bank account when you take the course for up to $25 an hour for 6 hours to take this program. It's actually a good program that will help you in your safety continuing. Next slide, please. We have released our 5-year strategy. It's again addresses OC disease, mental health, and traumatic injury. But more importantly, it will be focusing on evidence and outcome, the way people learn, incentives to attract and incentivize businesses to become more health and safety compliant. And that will be both an economic incentive as well as other incentives made available. And then the last one will be the focus on small business. As I mentioned, 80% of Ontario's business is small, under 50. So we really want to be able to focus on those 4 pillars over the next 5 years and work with industry and associations in order to characterize Ontario. It is the safest province in the country. But to quote the Auditor General, we're not sure why. So all our efforts over the past 3 years, certainly when I've been there, is to figure out why and to set the foundation to move forward. Next slide. And there are a number of resources available, and I think this slide presentation will be available, but the workplace resources on COVID-19, that's the 250 that are out there plus others. The SOCI program, the Health and Safety Excellence Program through WSIB, the Free and Health and Safety Training Program, and resources for health and safety training and consulting that's available to employers across the province. So I believe on that note, I would again like to thank Michael, and I look forward to the questions later on in this seminar.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ron. I'm going to jump into the topic of prevention, and it'll dovetail quite nicely with Ron's comments. As you would imagine, the best safety device we can come up with is that careful worker. It's very easy to say, hard to implement. And it really does start with trying to ingrain in every worker you have that safety habit. And if we could move the slide now to the next one, please. We all know that we can't guarantee an accident-free workplace, but there are steps your organization can take to build that culture of safety. And it really does start with leadership. It means leadership not only speaking up, but being visible on this topic so that everybody in the organization from top to bottom understand that safety is the priority and that everybody is expected to play a role. So we really do want to see, I'd call it, as opposed to just simply a senior member, we talk about champions, and we want people to champion that concept so that your culture becomes ingrained with working safely at every turn. We also will need, though, to hold managers and supervisors accountable, just like employees, with respect to carrots and sticks, as we call it. The carrots are the incentivizing that Ron talked about, and that can be implemented at an employee level as well, and that's something for employers we suggest you consider. A hierarchy of controls Ron has touched on already, but it's really critical. It's where everything starts. It's that step-by-step approach that Ron talked about, to eliminate and or reduce the risks. And that takes everybody working together. And some of us talk about the internal responsibility system where everybody plays a role. When we look at this, we think there are at least two bases that where you want to look to for guidance, and that's the act itself, but also the regulations that are specific to certain industries. And then your own workplace specifically and how to eliminate or at least reduce some of the hazards and risks inherent in your workplace. And COVID has taught all of us a lot. There are very, very different and unique ways to fight against COVID, depending upon the kind of workplace we're in, whether you're in an office setting or a health setting or a manufacturing setting. There are common steps, but also some very unique ones. We think overall it's easy to say, but effective communication is really critical, and training. And it can't just happen once, and it must be documented. Very important that it be documented. Here's where I think a leader can really help with those who are in the recruiting process or screening process or hiring or onboarding. This is where we can introduce this concept of safety so that we start to ensure workers hear us as they come and join us. They ought to be motivated to speak up. And we've all heard, and I've listened to Ron and other conversations talk about the new worker or the young worker. We need those folks who we know will be hesitant to speak up, to be encouraged and comfortable when worried about a work environment that they're placed in, that they will speak up. They'll talk to a peer, they'll talk to a shift leader, they'll talk to a member of the Joint Health and Safety Committee. Champions can actually make this work by ensuring that everybody throughout the organization knows it's not about skipping a step so that we can have greater or quicker productivity. It's about producing in a very safe manner. So this is one example. We all know that COVID is seen to be a hazard in the workplace. It's affected numerous workplaces throughout our country, let alone the globe. Here's an example of what you might go through if you were trying to check in on a hazard assessment like COVID. Are there things in the schedules of work that you might be able to amend or fix to reduce that spread of COVID? We saw lots of people go to second shifts. We saw lots of people change their start and stop times. Notice that we learned as time went on too, and Ron mentioned this, that idea that there seems to be more COVID happening pre-shift, on the way to work, during lunch and breaks. And there were means that we all learned in terms of how to reduce that. And you'll see a number of the examples we've used. If we move to the next one, this is where we have to do 2 or 3 things at least to try to convince workers that we want them to speak up. So there's got to be a variety of avenues. Some of us have even used 1-800 numbers. Anything to get someone to speak up if they're concerned about a health and safety concern in that workplace. We need repetitive communication of our policies. Again, written policies that may need to be updated depending upon what has occurred. And many of us have been updating policies and we'll talk about it shortly, workplace safety plans that were mandated during this time as well. Very important to develop metrics, and it's music to my ears. And I know a number of you, when you hear Ron talk about evidence, gathering evidence to try to ensure that the training we put in place in the future will have more pointed impact where we're still suffering from critical injuries or fatalities, God forbid. We are seeing some very important evidence about time of shift, age of worker, new worker to the country, language challenges. All of these things, as we become aware of them, we can deal with them effectively, and that's really important. We also say every workplace, when there is an incident, think about a root cause analysis, really critical. And then finally, remember there are resources. Ron went through a bevy of resources that you should avail yourself of. Also WSPS under the Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, also a great resource to assist. We all know that there's also a workplace violence risk assessment that's required, looking at the nature, the type of work, working conditions, common and specific. But in here's one that's coming up. Today, September 22, we have that vaccination evidence that's required to enter a number of non-essential places, and there's going to be conflict. Unfortunately, there's going to be conflict, and therefore every employer ought to be thinking a bit about, what do I need to do to reduce and protect my worker? If we could go to the next one, please. And again, once you complete this assessment, it is important that you provide it to your joint health and safety committee or a worker rep if you don't have a joint health and safety committee in place. Look at the kinds of things that you might trigger another workplace violence assessment, right? Your facility's gone through extensive renovations. There's actually been, unfortunately, an incident. Or we've got external changes like we continue to live through in these last 18 months with respect to legislative or regulatory or directives coming out of municipal governments. All of those may trigger a need to go to the workplace risk assessment. Here are some easy ones. We know that, for example, as people start to attempt to enter, and we briefly talked about that earlier, but as they start to attempt to enter and get refused entry because of today's new directive in place today, there's going to be some conflict. And what we think about there are, how do you reduce it? Physical barriers. We already know that we've got physical barriers in place as part of COVID. Hygiene practices. That physical barrier can also work to the advantage of the individual who might get into, unfortunately, a heated discussion about their inability to enter a facility. Other things to think about. Can you ensure the employee at your door, if you're a restaurant or a bar or a theater, isn't isolated and working on their own? Really critical if that's possible. And then finally, do you have a process when and if there is any kind of an escalation? Does that person already know who they're supposed to call, how they're supposed to hopefully dampen the agitation in the conversation? Here's an area that's coming up today that I think all employers need to think about as many of us try to open up in a much greater manner. And we still like this to be written down. It's one thing for me to communicate to, in my workplace, a receptionist. It's another thing to have a written policy so that that person has a practice and a protocol in the event that something happens, so that we can look back and say, did we do everything we could to reduce any risk in that situation? You all know by now, but I'll repeat it for everybody, that we know we need to have a COVID-19 safety plan in place. We can help with that. There are many examples of what needs to be in the COVID plan, and we'll talk about that in these next couple of slides. But remember, it needs to be in place before you reopen. It should be communicated to your workers before you reopen. And it should be repeatedly communicated. So it's not just a one-time event. There should be updates, almost like toolbox talks that some of us will recall from a construction site. In that safety plan, we see it as remaining in place for quite a period of time yet. And so if you're looking for that, any of my colleagues can help resource that for you. But let's talk about some of the things that should be in it in the next couple of slides. It really is a written roadmap of what you have done or will do to try to reduce this hazard in your workplace. It's going to address things like screening. And we know 4 to 6 weeks ago, the screening protocol was updated. So it's important to be up to date on that. Physical distancing, masks, face coverings, and so forth. I don't mean to make light of it, but the one comment I do want to leave you with is it's up to our leaders to communicate the importance of adhering to these processes. All are very critical. I think some of us are experiencing a malaise after 18 months. And, do I really need to tell that person to put their mask back on? Leaders need to do it. We need that culture built in that we are not out of this yet, but together, if we follow these processes, we'll get out of this quicker. Let's just talk quickly about inspections. Often you don't get a warning when an inspector shows up. Some of these are, as you heard Ron say, they're inspections without a complaint. Some of them are with a complaint. But it's very important from our perspective that you contact somebody on our team here because you want to, as quickly as possible, to understand what your role is in the nature of the inspection. You want to gather and organize information in advance if at all possible. And sometimes if you don't get that warning and the inspector shows up and you're taking that person through the workplace, somebody else can be working to put together information that is required. We hope that you're able to do some of this in advance, to have done what we would call a self-audit, so that you're noticing existing deficiencies and taking steps to remedy them. Always want to have a point person who actually greets and accompanies the inspector. Let's talk about just quick do's and don'ts. We always say be cooperative and be responsive. Review your documents with counsel externally if you can before handing them over to the inspector. Doesn't always work, but if you get a chance to, it's really critical to try to do that. Disclose only what they've asked you for. Sometimes we see people handing an entire document over when they really only have asked you for a certain section of the document. If you're at all concerned, please call us. We'll be in touch very quickly to respond to any questions you may have. You know, we have a 24-hour line. We mean it. We use it effectively, and you will get calls back immediately, if not picked up on the spot, obviously. Let's talk about don'ts. These are really simple, but they're important. That inspector, you want to take care of that person when they arrive. You do not want to allow them to walk through your workplace unaccompanied. Somebody always accompanies them. Try not to get into an argument with an inspector. Try to get into an information sourcing discussion so that you understand the basis of the person's concern. Try not to raise topics that they've not raised with you. And again, be careful with respect to the kind of information you provide. Sometimes an inspector's request, and I've seen this often, where you can't satisfy their request on the spot. Explain why the information is available. Let's take notes so that we know we will follow up, and establish a timeline for following up. Document, document, document. You heard me say that at the beginning, really critical. If we move from there, I want to close just with some things that I hope you'll think about from a prevention perspective. Somebody does a self-audit to try to understand where are our gaps, where are those dangers or hazards that still exist. Can we do that way before an inspector's at the door? Because we have a leader in our workplace who is championing a safety culture. Cooperate with that inspector. If they find non-compliance, sometimes a discussion can be had where you can correct the non-compliance on the spot without an order. Great success if that's possible. Sometimes you're still going to get an order. When you get an order, we still think remedy as soon as possible. There are forms, obviously, to notify the ministry of your remedying of that gap that they've identified. And again, we'll help if we can. Please be in touch. We will respond quickly. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Lisa, to take you through what to do in the event that there is an unfortunate accident.
Thanks very much, Mike. Next, we're going to take a look at what to do if a serious injury occurs in your workplace and the potential charges and penalties that an employer can face following an accident. So things to do, most immediately, make sure that you're providing medical assistance to anybody who's injured. You also want to secure the scene of the accident. So cordon it off, make sure that nobody is entering the area except for the purposes of preserving life, to provide first aid, or to make sure that there isn't any unnecessary damage to equipment or property. You want to give us a call immediately, because it's very important at the outset to make sure that if we can put privilege in place, if we're doing an investigation ultimately, and we're here to answer any questions that you may have about whether something is a critical injury and the reporting requirements, because there are obligations to report certain types of accidents to the ministry, to the Joint Health and Safety Committee, and to a trade union if it's required. Other things to do, make sure that you make a record of who the witnesses are, any first aiders. You're going to need their contact information, and if they're not your employee, you may ultimately not be able to find them later. You also want to make sure that you obtain or secure any accident scene video. So think about CCTV that could be in your workplace, but also don't forget that everybody's walking around with a cell phone, and sometimes people do have either the entire accident on video or portions of the accident. Also, you want to be collecting copies of any relevant documents. So they could be things like daily inspection sheets, policies, work procedures, also employee training. Those are things you're going to want to gather most immediately, and the ministry in many cases will be wanting to have copies of those. Also, looking ahead to doing an investigation, you want to make sure that that's done without delay, particularly in cases where there's a critical injury. You will have your Joint Health and Safety Committee doing its own investigation, but we always recommend, in the case of critical injury, that you are doing an investigation with the assistance of counsel so that you have the benefit of privilege. Also, as Mike mentioned, always be sure to accompany and cooperate with ministry inspector. Things not to do. It's tempting sometimes to clean up or just simply tidy things in the scene of the accident. You should not be doing that. You don't want to make any changes to the scene of the accident until it's been cleared by the ministry. You also don't want to continue with any other work in the area where the accident has happened. And for witnesses, make sure that they don't leave the workplace without permission. You want to know if they're leaving the workplace. And certainly you don't want to speculate as to the cause of the accident. It's often a question that other people will be asking. The ministry may be asking of your witnesses, of anybody who has seen the incident, to give their thoughts on what the cause of the accident is. In most cases, employers don't know on the day of the accident exactly what the cause of the accident was. So avoid that temptation to speculate. Wait until the investigation is over and you have more information. I mentioned earlier reporting requirements. So for a critical injury, there is an immediate notification requirement. So that's picking up the phone and calling the ministry. You also need to notify the Joint Health and Safety Committee and the trade union if there is one. And then in addition to that telephone notification, there's a requirement to file a written report within 48 hours, and that can now be done online to help speed up the process. But you need to keep track of that 48-hour period, because if you don't file that report, there could be charges specifically for failing to comply with that obligation. If there's an accident, explosion, fire, or an incident of workplace violence that causes injury, there's also a written notice requirement, and that's required within 4 days. And at project sites or mines, if there are certain prescribed incidents that occur, that also will trigger a 2-day written notice as well. So what is a critical injury? It's defined in a regulation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. It includes a fatality, incidents that place life in jeopardy, if someone becomes unconscious, substantial loss of blood. So that's more than a minor amount of blood, something that's going to approach, putting someone's life in jeopardy or have serious consequences. It's a fracture of a leg or an arm, amputation of a leg, arm, hand, or foot, burns to a major portion of the body, or loss of the sight in an arm. And when you look at that list, and you should always be looking at the list at the time of the accident, giving us a call and we'll go through the list with you, because that's what's going to trigger that reporting requirement for a critical injury. But you may not know in the exact time of the accident whether, for example, that injury to the leg is actually a fracture. So even if you don't learn about it until later, when you do know it's a fracture, you still have that reporting obligation. There is a 1-year limitation period for an Occupational Health and Safety Act charge. So even though you may get through the accident time period and there may not be any further requests from the ministry, there is that 1-year limitation period that you have to keep an eye on. And that limitation period was extended for a period of time during the pandemic. Those charges may come later after the accident. Common charges that do come up time and time again, particularly if there's been a critical injury. They result from a lack of instruction or training of employees or supervisors, machinery that's not guarded, for example, or cleaning of the machinery that's done without de-energizing the machinery. Failing to comply with fall protection requirements is still an issue. And then there's always the catch-all provision in the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which is failing to take all reasonable precautions for the protection of a worker. Now, it's important to know too that you don't actually have to have an accident. Someone does not need to be critically injured in order for charges to be laid. There just simply needs to be a contravention of the requirements under the Act. Now, if charges are laid, in the event there is not a guilty plea and it does proceed to trial, the Crown has to prove all elements of the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. But under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, offenses under the Act are considered to be strict liability offenses. So what that really means is that the Crown does not have to prove intent. So They don't have to prove that you intended to violate the act, just simply that the factual circumstances make out the charge under the act that the requirements have been violated. Now, employers do have a couple of defenses available, the main one being due diligence. And in that case, an employer has to demonstrate that the employer's taken all precautions that are reasonable in the circumstances to protect the worker, to avoid or prevent the accident. And so Mike mentioned earlier the importance from a prevention standpoint of having policies, practices, procedures, training, education. Those are all things that are going to lead to hopefully a successful due diligence defense if you are facing charges. And monitoring and enforcement is also important too. And that monitoring can take the form of those self-audits, the inspections that are done on a daily basis, and enforcement can be, for example, disciplinary practices in the event that any of your employees have failed to put on that fall protection or failed to use other PPE in the workplace. And we can't underscore enough the importance of documenting it. It's much, much easier to put forward a due diligence defense if it's backed up in writing than simply to have to rely on witness testimony to say, oh yes, I trained that particular worker on how to properly clean the equipment. There is another defense which is called officially induced error, but it doesn't come up very often because it requires there to have been a government authority that has contributed to the course of action that led to the violation of the act. And ministry inspectors are pretty careful not to create that type of a situation. Now, we often get questions from employers in situations where critical injuries have occurred and it appears that there may be charges that are laid. Employers sometimes say, well, the inspector was just here 2 weeks ago and walked by or looked at that machinery and didn't raise any issues. That's not officially induced error. There has to be something much more specific to show an active contribution to the course of action that led to the contravention. All right, so turning now to the Occupational Health and Safety Act sentencing principles, there are really three principles: deterrence, retribution, and rehabilitation or reform. Deterrence is really the main one that is taken into consideration, and it's made up of general deterrence and specific deterrence for that particular defendant. There are a number of sentencing factors, but for the most part, the main ones tend to be the size of the company, penalties imposed in similar cases, and we can also sometimes reduce the penalty by demonstrating significant post-accident health and safety prevention efforts have been taken by the employer. And that's going beyond what is necessary to bring the employer into compliance with the Act. Now, sentences are typically fines, but that may be changing. And I'll just quickly go through a couple of cases where you can see that, the rule at the end of the day may not be a fine. And so that's something to take into account. I put there the maximum fine amounts, and that's an increase significantly in the last few years. So about 3 years ago, fines for corporations went from 500,000 to 1.5 million. Individuals from 25,000 to 100,000, plus the potential for what used to be 6 months is now 12 months imprisonment. And the key thing to consider here is that it's per charge. Now, we often used to see after a critical injury, if there were charges, maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 charges that arise out of the incident. Now we are frequently seeing 4, 5, or 6 charges. And you should always keep in mind that that fine amount is also subject to a 25% victim surcharge. So you're going to pay 25% more than what the actual fine is. Just a couple of cases. One is Newmex, and this is from 2019. Really egregious circumstances. A worker with known epilepsy had a seizure while working at heights, fell to the ground and died. There was no fall protection in place, and there was no training of this particular individual. It was a small company and ultimately the company and 2 directors pled guilty to multiple OHSA charges. The company was fined $250,000, which was well above what similar cases were given the financial circumstances and size of the company. And the individuals received 25 days in jail plus 12 months of probation. Now, on appeal, these sentences were considered to be out of range, mostly because of the specific factors in this case, and that it wasn't necessary for deterrence. So on appeal, it was reduced to $50,000 for the corporation, and the jail term was voided, and then ultimately it was $15,000 fine per individual. Now, the court ultimately dismissed a subsequent appeal by the Crown and found that compelling reasons were needed to depart from penalties in similar cases. So this gives us the reinforcement that it's important to look at similar cases to see what is actually a reasonable fine amount. Another case that I want to point out to you is the Lafarge case, and it happened in 2019. So this was a fall from heights, and a worker died in that case. The company pled guilty and was fined $400,000, and that was based on a joint submission. So the Crown and the defendant got together and decided that that was an appropriate fine amount. The company, however, had prior convictions with previous fines that were quite significant. The court noted the maximum penalty would be appropriate for a future violation in this case, and also suggested that an internal monitor might be something that the court would impose as a term of probation if there was ever a future violation. So here we see the court going a little bit beyond just simply a fine, although in this case it was only the fine, but opening the door to more significant penalties for the employer in that case. Bring forward to Vixman Construction, which was an early 2020 case before the pandemic. And here it was another fatality case, and it was as a result of an improper use of a fall restraint system. The company was convicted, they went to trial, and there was a conviction on 2 charges. There was a joint sentence proposed by the company and the Crown in that case of $125,000 in total, and that was rejected by the court. And it, not so much the amount was rejected, but the court viewed the fact that it was only a fine and found that that was not sufficient to achieve the core objective of the act. Now, what the court did was, in addition to that fine, it imposed an 18-month probation and required the company to publicly acknowledge the offense in a safety article that was to be published in the safety magazine and also on the ministry website, and to produce a safety training video, which was to be made available on the ministry website. So these are very new and quite significant things that the court asked the employer to do, or actually required the employer to do in that case. Now, almost immediately after that case, the sentencing took place in that case, the pandemic began. So we don't know at this point whether the more creative aspects of that sentencing decision will actually take hold. Many cases are on hold or moving very slowly now as we are still continuing within the pandemic. So we'll have to take a wait and see approach on that, but it's something to consider. There are also some other considerations that that go along with being sentenced for an OHSA conviction. And one is the media coverage, not only at the time of the accident, but also at the time of sentencing. And the ministry puts out a press release. So that will be available on the internet. There's negative impact potentially for your corporate brand and goodwill, and also a potential impact in the event of business contracts. So in some sectors, as part of a procurement process, you're going to have to indicate that you've been convicted, or the company has, of Occupational Health and Safety Act charges. There's also potential for a personal liability. We're seeing more charges against supervisors, directors, officers than we ever have in the past. And there is also still a potential for charges under the criminal code. And these we refer to as Bill C-45 charges. And the definition from the criminal code is up there on the screen. But essentially it's anyone who undertakes or has the authority to direct how someone else works has a legal duty to take reasonable steps to prevent bodily harm to that person. Now, criminal charges are relatively rare, but there is a significant risk for situations where it's a repeat offense, or if the evidence shows that the company or individuals have shown a disregard for worker safety or for the obligations under the Act. Now, you can also expect that if there are criminal charges, there will also be OHSA charges that are included as well. So just a couple of takeaways. Make sure that that you take heed of what we've talked about in terms of a strong safety culture. It will help reduce the risk of a workplace accident. You also want to be doing frequent health and safety audits, inspections, and make sure that there are written work instructions in place and the appropriate training to back that up. That's ultimately going to help not only in prevention, but also in demonstrating that you've taken due diligence. And as always, we're available. If we use our 24-hour line, there is a critical injury if it takes place in the nighttime or when you can't reach us directly. And you want to make sure definitely that you're doing that if it's a reportable injury that occurs in the workplace. All right, so we're going to move now to the Q&A portion of the program. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to start us off with the questions and some of the answers to those questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Lisa. So we've got a great question to get started. There are a number of them in the queue, so we're going to try to get through as many as we can. And all three of us are going to dive in depending upon the question. The first one I want to cover from one of our attendees was, what do you know about the new vaccine passport in Ontario, which came into effect today? What do we need to have and what could happen if we don't? So we're lucky. We already have a briefing note up on the website that will provide a significant amount of information on the vaccine passport. So I ask people to think about jumping onto that our website at Sherrod Coos LLP. It should be of help. A couple things to remember. This applies to patrons of certain businesses who want to access the indoor areas. So for example, restaurants, bars, cinemas, gyms. People who want to enter those facilities or sites will need to have a copy of the vaccination receipt to show that you've had a full dose of the HC vaccine at least 14 days ago. You'll also need identification that corresponds to the vaccine receipt. And we're told that in or around October 22nd, we're also supposed to have a QR code that will provide this same information. If you don't have, or you don't have the documentation of a medical exemption, you should be denied access to the premises. And businesses that do not comply with the requirement for this information can in fact be subject to fines and penalties under the Reopening Ontario Act. So again, take a look at the website. We hope there's some good guidance there that will help you with this. Ron, let me jump to you with a question. This is around whether you can comment on any extensions on training requirements from 2021. So, for example, are you aware of whether the ministry will be extending? I think there was some extensions around working at height, but any of the Joint Health and Safety Committee training, are there any plans and what are the parameters, if there are plans, to extend those deadlines for repeat training or new training?
Thanks, Michael. So there was a year's cohort, end of February to beginning of March 2021, where we took that year's cohort of expired working at heights and joint occupational health and safety, and we said, look, you've got to buy, but after March 2021 as an example, there was sufficient capacity in the system to be able to take and recertify or to certify in those credentials. And in the spring of 2020, we implemented the virtual training. So you can now take joint occupational health and safety and health and safety rep on a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting quite conveniently. They have the 2 and 3 day programs that are available. With respect to working at heights, we did get exemptions to allow people to take in-person training in August, so that August of 2020, So people can now take the training in person. We just limit the numbers that are available. So there's really no reason to extend any longer. And inspectors, I mean, some people are going to get caught in the wash. There's still some confusion out there. So inspectors are cognizant of that as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question I'll jump in on. The question is for clarity. Can workplaces with closed access to the public allow their staff to remove a mask if 2-meter distances can be kept and everyone is fully vaccinated, or is this only a public health recommendation? And the answer is yes. Under Regulation 364/20, an individual is exempt from the masking obligation if the individual performs work for the business or organization, is in an area that is not accessible to members of the public, and is able to maintain a physical distance of at least 2 meters from every other person while in the indoor area. Ron, the next question is interesting. The person's asked, can you identify any of has your office identified any of the more frequent causes or root causes of accidents over the last decade? Are there ones that are repeating themselves that our listeners should be aware of?
Yes, we're starting to look at injury by occupation as opposed to injury by sector. And what we did find from an extensive, I guess, 10-year study, a couple of things. One is that non-skilled labor within the first year of working tend to have could be up to 25 to 35% of the injuries occur where unskilled labor is not sufficiently oriented to the nature of work, or the nature of work is such that they're not completely aware of the risks. If we look at construction as an example, 40% of accidents occurred in the first year were new workers, and that new workers doesn't necessarily mean a young worker. It can be, a new Canadian that's in transition to their profession, getting a job on a construction site. We also know that the 18 to 25-year-old cohort are more susceptible to injury, and then it is the 50 to 55-year-old that are next susceptible. So it's almost like people get hurt because they're new, but they don't get hurt for 20 years and they get overconfident and they get hurt when they get hurt. We also find that certain days of the week, Fridays, particularly Fridays before a long weekend, which is important that at noon hour on a Friday, have a toolbox talk. It resets the clock. If you talk about falls from heights, it's not falls from 30 stories, it's falls from 4 meters that are the problem. So it's overconfidence. We actually did a survey of 5,000 workers, and we found out that 80% of the working population are either know or eager to know everything there needs to know about health and safety. We know that they want to learn face-to-face. They want to learn from their supervisor. They don't want to learn from a pamphlet. But we also know that there's 20% of the population that they live risky anyway. And they are the ones, we've done some behavioral science studies, they're the ones that are reluctant to wear masks. They're the ones that feel it's appropriate to have a beer at lunch. And they're the ones that feel it's appropriate to go out back and smoke a joint. So there is an inherently risky component of the population. And what we suggest with some people is always partner a new employee with your best employee. If you partner them with your worst employee, you'll end up with 2 worst employees sometimes. So
that's great. Thank you very much. Quick question as well that I'll try to address. If somebody refuses to undergo the temperature check or the screening questions, can an employer refuse entry to the workplace? And the answer is yes. Under the Reopening Ontario Act and its regs, a business can't actually permit an employee to enter the workplace if they fail the provincial screening questions. So it is actually something that not only can you, but you should be preventing that person from entering your workplace. I wonder with that, Lisa, should we turn it over to you if you've got some questions going as well?
Sure, Mike, I've got quite a few here. So one question was about when the screening questions change. We have seen over time a change in the screening questions that we are required to ask employees each day. So the question was, do we need to update a policy if this isn't a policy, in addition to the questions employees are asked each day before coming into work? So absolutely, you need to update the questions that you're asking the employees when they go into work. So if it's on paper, or if you've got it on an app, you need to make sure that you're asking the correct questions and that the employees are giving their responses. If it's in the policy and you've got the specific questions listed in the policy, you should update that as well. But if the policy is more general and just refers to the making sure that they complete the screening tool, then you don't specifically have to update the policy to add in those new questions. We've had a number of questions about vaccinations, and one is with the new trend of vaccination policies. The question is, has the new trend of vaccination policies already raised the standard of due diligence? In other words, is it now expected that employers will take a stance towards vaccination in the workplace? And this is a great question. And you're really going to have to drill down to where your actual work location is, because in many public health regions of the province, the regional officers of health have recommended, and in some cases very strongly recommended, that an employer implement a vaccination policy. So here we're thinking about Toronto, Peel, Halton, Hamilton, and there are others as well. And you'll want to see our recent briefing note on that from September the 2nd. Which is available on our website. Now, under the Reopening Ontario Act, a business is required to adhere to those public health recommendations. So that's the tie-in to make it a requirement if you are in those particular public health regions. But regardless, it's a good idea to be able to demonstrate that you took all reasonable steps to reduce the potential for workplace transmission of COVID-19. And you'll remember from Ron's comments that a lot of that transmission takes place in the break rooms. It takes place in common areas, even outside where people go to smoke, for example. So that's something to take into account. And we can certainly assist any organization that wants to introduce a vaccination policy, and we can go through and talk to you about the benefits and the risks of doing that. And we did have a number of other questions about vaccination policies. So on those, if you could refer to our March 15, 2021 briefing note that has a whole series of questions and answers. So have a look back at that if we're not otherwise answering your question, and you know that you can always reach out to us as well. There was another question about staff working from home. So what if there's an accident that happens in the home when one of your staff members is working at home? So the Occupational Health and Safety Act does not apply to work that's performed in a private residence, but it can still be a compensable injury under the Workplace Safety and Insurance Act if it does arise out of or in the course of someone's employment. So for that reason, you might want to implement a protocol to ensure that employee workstations at home are set up in an ergonomically appropriate manner and safe from tripping hazards, things like that. So that's always a good practice to implement. I had another question about, and this is an interesting one. Apparently, some companies are encouraging employees to wear wristbands and other indicators to signal their comfort level with physical contact during COVID. So the question came with examples of a green wristband, meaning high fives or other contact is fine. Yellow, meaning cautious, elbows only. Red, meaning no contact, 2 meters apart at all times. And the question for us is, do you have views on these types of systems? I think the underlying and the most important part of the answer to this is to make sure that in your workplace, you're still complying with the public health guidance around physical distancing, barriers between workstations, even if employees are personally comfortable with being in close proximity to one another. It's the distancing requirements that have to trump the friendliness in those circumstances. And you need to be careful, I think, as an employer, not to be encouraging people to get closer than those distancing requirements that we have in place. And again, that goes back to looking at the break rooms, the areas in your workplace where people might socialize to get a coffee, that sort of thing. So ultimately, it's up to your individual company, but make sure that you're complying with the public health distancing requirements.
Lisa,
Go ahead.
if I might add to your listeners, if additional information is wanted for your employees who are working at home, if you go to simply Google CRE or CRE MSD, MSD is in musculoskeletal disorders, the University of Waterloo, we fund them, and there is all kinds of online materials, including online assessments that individuals working at home can do to check their ergonomics of their workstation, because strains and sprains are really the most prevalent thing coming out of working from home right now. So that's just an added resource that they could go to.
And that's a great way that you as an employer can, assist with the sort of the training. You can put out a bulletin for your workers who are working at home, just to remind them about those resources and how to make sure that their setup is not going to cause repetitive strains, for example.
Lisa, there's a good question in the Q&A right now as well. The question says, say that rapid testing is implemented for non-vaccinated employees. Can employees refuse to be tested? Can employers refuse entry to those who refuse to be tested? And that's a common question coming up these days. And I think many people believe if you refuse to be tested, can the employer refuse entry in that situation? And we actually think they can. The real question will become, if you refuse entry, are you actually terminating employment? Or, for example, are you putting them on leave for the day or until such time as they're vaccinated or have undergone the rapid testing? But we think that's lawful. And again, it will be seen to be tested at some point, but it's all about, is your policy reasonable? Are you taking reasonable steps? Are you communicating effectively to your workforce? And are you giving them options with respect to how to participate in that culture of safety, frankly?
We had that, Michael, we had that challenge in construction with a few of the larger general contractors that placed mandatory screening as part of their requirement. And you're right, the niggly part is the technical aspect of, are they on leave or are they terminated? They're just not allowed entry. And there was a test, I believe, with Elliston and LiUNA that suggested that the employer has the right to take every reasonable precaution to ensure the safety of the workplace.
Yeah, it's a good case to reference if anybody wants to read further on this. But Elliston, you're bang on, Ron. Ron, a couple of questions, and this may be the $1 million question, and I'll let you duck it if you'd like, and I mean it that way on purpose. But do you think the government will at some point move to spread by regulation their requirement that other sectors of the economy have mandatory vaccination? Do you think there's an appetite, or will we ever see something like that beyond what we've already seen?
I think that they're monitoring it really closely, because what we are finding is that larger employers are saying, it's one thing to require people to be vaccinated while they're working in their facility, but it's another thing when they're now dealing with employers who are refusing to come to work because fearful that they will be working with people who are unvaccinated. So there's a whole, this gets to the root cause of everything. And I do know that it's very extensively being discussed by the government, but not in a sense to go in any one direction. It's really, are they monitoring what, the mood of the economy is, the mood of the workers, the mood of employers, and so on and so forth. I think you'll see this latest launch of today as being a bit of a litmus test to see where they go down the road.
Okay. Thank you. Lisa, I interrupted. You may have other questions.
No, that's okay. For what I was going to see is I see in the Q&A a number of people didn't have their pens at the ready or couldn't take down quickly enough, Ron, that website for home evaluation on ergonomic workstation. If you could just repeat that again, I think.
Sure. If you simply Google CREMSD, it will come up the University of Waterloo Center for Research Excellence in Musculoskeletal Disorders. I can email you it, and we could maybe put it in later on, something out there on the actual website.
Great. I wonder at this point, Lisa, is this where we wrap up?
I think so. I think that brings us to the end of our Q&A and today's program. We hope that everyone found it to be helpful. If we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, you can always please drop us a line. And I do recommend people go back on our website. You can find that March 15, 2021 briefing note that does address a lot of the vaccination related questions. Our next HR review seminar will take place on Wednesday, December the 8th, 2021. The topic is currently in the design phase, and we'll send out an invitation in due course. If you are on our mailing list already, you will receive the invitation directly. If you're not on our mailing list and you do want to receive our briefing notes, newsletters, and invitations to seminars and workshops, please subscribe through our website. It's the big red bar at the bottom of every page. And finally, we'd be grateful if you could fill in the feedback form that you will receive shortly in your email. It's very helpful to us as we plan upcoming programs. And Ron, I'd like to thank you very much for joining our program today and providing your really valuable insights. And thank you to everyone else for attending the program. Have a great day and please stay safe.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Ron. Great to see you.
You too.